friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and welcome to We the People, a weekly show of constitutional debate. The National Constitution Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. This week, we have a two-part show on Alexander Hamilton. First, I'm delighted to share a new episode of our podcast Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness. Stephen Knott and Ken Burns join me to explore Hamilton's life and legacy, including the lessons he can teach us about how to control our ruling passion. Then you'll hear my recent conversation with the great Ron Chernow. I was honored to award Ron the 2025 Liberty Medal for his Hamilton biography, and I can't wait for you to hear our conversation. Here's Moderation with Alexander Hamilton from Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Look, as somebody who admires Hamilton, I never dreamed that Hamilton would become something of a pop icon.
That depends who's asking.
Oh, well, sure. Sir, I'm Alexander Hamilton. I'm at your service, sir.
That's Stephen Knott. He wrote his book, Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth, in 2002.
Thank God for Lin-Manuel Miranda. When I wrote the book, I had to explain to people, including my own mother, God rest her soul, who Alexander Hamilton was.
And it's no wonder. Alexander Hamilton's reputation has been shaped over time by those who knew him.
Jefferson's going to spend the bulk of his life, particularly after Hamilton's death in 1804, trying to cement that image in the American mind that Hamilton was a danger to Republican government.
And it's been shaped by people who didn't know him at all. During Reconstruction, for example, Hamilton was used as a patron saint for the expansion of federal power. Throughout American history, Hamilton has been invoked by Democrats and Republicans for partisan ends, and he's often been depicted as someone without restraint. But what if Hamilton actually has something to teach us about moderation?
He certainly had the opportunity to ride in on his horse, so to speak, and to topple the civilian rule under President Adams.
But that didn't happen.
In my view, next to George Washington, Alexander Hamilton is most responsible for the country that you and I have the privilege of living in.
Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and this is Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness. In addition to historian Stephen Knott, filmmaker Ken Burns joins me for this 8th of 12 episodes. We'll explore what the pursuit of happiness really meant to our founders, and what we can learn from their daily struggles to achieve self-improvement. In this episode, we explore the classical virtue of moderation through the polarizing life of Alexander Hamilton.
A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. And a government ill-executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be, in practice, a bad government. Alexander Hamilton.
Stephen Knott, it's such an honor to welcome you to the podcast. You have written the definitive book about the image of Alexander Hamilton throughout American history.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to talk about Alexander Hamilton, something of a hero of mine, although I like to think I'm fairly objective at the same time.
And I want to begin with the famous dinner party where Hamilton blurted out, "The greatest man in history was Julius Caesar," and Jefferson concluded that Hamilton was not only a monarchist, but an advocate for a monarchy bottomed on corruption. Tell us about how Jefferson converted Hamilton into an advocacy for monarchy and how that defined his image for so much of American history.
Jefferson recorded that 20 years after the fact and long after Hamilton was dead. So I'm one of the perhaps a few scholars who questions the veracity of Jefferson's account. But with that said, there's no doubt that Jefferson did believe that Hamilton was a monarchist and in favor of a monarchy. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Hamilton did deliver a speech in which he advocated a president elected for life. And Madison, of course, was at that convention. He would have told his friend Jefferson about that comment, And so there was some basis for seeing Hamilton as somebody who was in favor of so many elements of permanence and stability that there might be an honest interpretation to see Hamilton as something of an opponent of democracy or republicanism.
Hamilton always stressed that he was not for a hereditary monarchy, and that's what he meant by the Republican principle, but he did endorse a president for life, and his friend Gouverneur Morris, after Hamilton was dead, suggested that Hamilton always wanted to mount his hobby horse, which was essentially to ride in on a military escort and to install himself as a kind of military dictator. Is there any possibility that Hamilton did, in fact, aspire to overthrow Republican institutions?
I actually don't think so, Jeff. You're right about Gouverneur Morris. It was kind of a shocking tribute to his deceased friend to say that Hamilton had this Napoleonic streak. I don't see it. And to give you one concrete example, during the quasi-war with France, when Hamilton was basically put in charge of the United States Army, he certainly had the opportunity to ride in on his horse, so to speak, and to topple the civilian rule under President Adams. He did not do that. And in fact, when the threat from France during the quasi-war subsided, Hamilton went about dismantling the army that he had helped to create. So again, there was an opportunity there for Hamilton to act in a sort of Napoleonic fashion. He chose not to do so. George Washington, who I think was a good judge of character, always dismissed these allegations that Hamilton possessed this authoritarian streak. Washington saw Hamilton as a man of ambition, but of a noble kind of ambition in defense of Republican government. So I see Washington's testament to Hamilton's character, and I see Hamilton's dismantling of the army he commanded in 1798-99 as pretty strong evidence that this notion that he yearned to seize power through a military coup is a complete myth.
Far from advocating for Caesarism, Hamilton throughout his life warned of the danger of an authoritarian demagogue like Caesar who might flatter the people and overthrow popular elections. And he wrote in Federalist I, of those men who've overturned the liberties of a republic, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. And then he goes on to say, if Shays' rebellion had been headed by a Caesar or a Cromwell, who can predict what effect such a despotism would have on the liberties of the other states?
You're absolutely right. He feared Caesarism in a way just as much as any good Jeffersonian, but he saw the threat coming from a different angle, if you will. And the threat that Hamilton envisioned was, as you mentioned, a demagogue, somebody playing on the fears of the public, somebody flattering the public in order to rise to power and then turning on the people. Hamilton's study of history led him to believe that that was the more likely path to authoritarianism in the United States or in any republic. And so from Hamilton's perspective, what you needed was a national government that could defend attacks from abroad, but also suppress insurrections here at home that might be led by a demagogue who had dreams of establishing some type of authoritarian government. You see Hamilton urging a fairly, arguably ruthless suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion because Hamilton believed in ordered liberty. He believed that the rule of law was the key to preserving the republic. And any time an armed minority felt they had some grievance against the political order and they could take up arms, that's where the threat really presented itself. For Hamilton, a strong government protected against foreign attacks and enforced the rule of law here at home.
Both Hamilton and Jefferson feared a Caesar, but Hamilton feared a demagogue who would flatter the people from below, and Jefferson feared a Caesar who would come and suppress them from above. Hamilton, as you said, wanted to literally ride in on horseback with George Washington, which he did, in order to awe the people into submission. Jefferson favors pardoning the rebels and says a little insurrection every now and then is a good thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, Jefferson viewed the whole contretemps surrounding the Whiskey Rebellion as much ado about nothing. In fact, Jefferson referred to the Whiskey Rebellion as Hamilton's Rebellion. In other words, this was a trumped-up effort by Hamilton and the Federalists to suppress a democratic movement consisting of whiskey distillers who felt oppressed by the central government. Jefferson had a certain comfort level with the idea of rebellion. In fact, he was quoted as saying a little rebellion now and then is a healthy thing. For Hamilton, that kind of thinking, that kind of talk was very irresponsible. Again, Hamilton believed in the rule of law. Yes, the law needed to change, but not through violence, not at the point of a gun.
These competing positions that we're describing, as you have argued so powerfully, have really defined the difference between America's political parties for the past 250 years. National power versus states' rights, democracy versus rule by elites, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, across the board, there were principal differences between these two men. And ultimately, again, I think Jefferson had a kind of unfettered faith in the wisdom of the people, believed, in a sense, in majority rule. Hamilton's vision of the world, Hamilton's vision for the United States was one rooted in the idea that while popular consent was an important element of the new American experiment, there had to be limits placed on that type of popular rule. And you see that in Hamilton's defense of a strong judiciary. And you see that, I would argue, most clearly in the contesting views of Jefferson and Hamilton on the French Revolution. Jefferson did seem to sanction violence in France during the French Revolution. He writes to a protege, William Short, and suggests that if the French revolutionaries have to kill every man and woman in France, save one man and one woman to keep the species alive, so be it. That's the price one has to pay for a new world order. Again, for Hamilton, that type of a vision, that comfort level with revolutionary violence was appalling. Both of these men are shaped by their upbringings. Jefferson had a comfortable upbringing as a member of the Virginia gentry. Hamilton had a completely dysfunctional upbringing in the Caribbean. For Hamilton, the world could be a dark place where people could turn on you at a moment's notice. A father could abandon you at a moment's notice. Jefferson had, I think, a more rose-colored view of human nature. And again, that is going to tincture their view on all sorts of policy issues.
I've told you how much I admired and learned from your wonderful book, Alexander Hamilton and the Persistence of Myth. You say that Jefferson founds the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to Hamilton's supposed monarchism and insists that it will defend the principles of democracy and limited government. Then Lincoln, in founding the Republican Party, insists that I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from Jefferson and claims Jefferson as the heir of the successor to the Whigs. Then after the Civil War, there's a Hamiltonian revival, and James Garfield and others invoke Hamilton as the new patron saint of the post-Reconstruction expansion of federal power. Then we're up to the Progressive era, when Theodore Roosevelt calls for Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends and founds the Progressive movement in a vigorous federal government to constrain the corporations. Then FDR just has the chutzpah to reinvent the Democrats as the party of Jeffersonian democracy as opposed to limited government, and puts Jefferson on the nickel and builds the Jefferson Memorial. And then finally, Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party because it had abandoned the principles of Jefferson, and reinvents the Republican Party as the party of Jeffersonian limited government.
I need you to take my place in future interviews when I talk about Hamilton's legacy.
No,
that was terrific. Hamilton's Federalist Party, it's gone by 1820. The Jeffersonians have succeeded in portraying that party as the party of elitists, if not the party of outright British agents, the party of monarchy. Elements of Hamilton's party will be found in the Republican Party created in 1854. Now, you're absolutely right, Jeff. Lincoln is going to cite Jefferson repeatedly. He's going to say all honor to Jefferson. He views Jefferson as the poet of the American founding. But I have to say, I actually think if you look beneath the surface, Lincoln is far more of a Hamiltonian than he is a Jeffersonian. He believes in internal improvements. He's in favor of ending the expansion of slavery. There's far more of that heritage in the Federalist Party of Hamilton than there is in Jefferson's States' Rights Party, which really becomes the party of segregation for most of American history. Obviously, that's going to change in the mid to late 20th century. But I see Abraham Lincoln as something of a closet Hamiltonian. And as you mentioned, Jeff, in the 20th century, the early progressives are going to admire Hamilton for his energetic executive, for arguably a more assertive federal government at the expense of states' rights. But Franklin Roosevelt is the master of sort of taking elements from each of those traditions, merging it into the New Deal coalition. And I have to say, Jeff, during the New Deal and during the mid-20th century, Hamilton's reputation is arguably at its lowest. The perception that Hamilton had these fascist, authoritarian inclinations is going to live on even up to our day. And it's primarily through the heirs of Jefferson and the Democratic Party that that mythology is handed down from generation to generation. Thank God for Lin-Manuel Miranda. I think we're now seeing a re-examination of Hamilton that's long overdue.
On Lin-Manuel Miranda, it was fortuitous for Hamilton that the musical came out during President Obama's term. President Obama previewed it at the White House, a kind of workshop performance.
There is a reason why this has become a cultural phenomenon. In Ron Chernow's extraordinary biography of Alexander Hamilton, Lin-Manuel picked up this biography at the airport for some light beach reading, but he identified a quintessentially American story. In the character of Hamilton, Lin-Manuel saw something of his own family, and every immigrant family. And in the Hamilton that Lin-Manuel and his incredible cast and crew bring to life, we recognize the improbable story of America and the spirit that has sustained our nation for over 240 years.
And around the same time, Obama gave a speech at Cooper Union explicitly invoking Hamilton as what would become the patron saint of healthcare reform, and explicitly embraced Hamilton with the aid of his pop culture apotheosis.
It's worth taking a moment to reflect on the role that the market has played in the development of the American story. The great task before our founders was putting into practice the ideal that government could simultaneously serve liberty and advance the common good. For Alexander Hamilton, the young Secretary of the Treasury, that task was bound to the vigor of the American economy.
Talk about what Lin-Manuel Miranda has done to restore Hamilton, and have the Democrats fully owned the Hamiltonian legacy or not?
Yeah, I wouldn't say they fully owned it, Jeff. They've owned perhaps aspects of it, but there's still this sense, and particularly in liberal quarters, that Hamilton was an elitist and had a certain contempt for the people whom he allegedly called the great beast. I don't think he ever said that. That's the mythology. When I wrote the book, there was a complete lack of understanding. Perhaps they knew he was the guy on the $10 bill, or he'd been killed in a duel. That was it. So Miranda has put Hamilton back on the map. I have some qualms with some of the portrayal of Hamilton. Love the musical, terrific entertainment. But thank God for Lin-Manuel Miranda. You know, they were going to take Hamilton off the $10 bill. And I think it's due to Miranda that he stays on there. In my view, next to George Washington, Alexander Hamilton is most responsible for the country that you and I have the privilege of living in, that emerged as a military and economic superpower, and ultimately, belatedly, fulfilled the promises of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. If it weren't for the federal government that Hamilton and Washington launched, the promises of the Declaration, at least for African Americans, would never have been delivered upon.
I have to say, Stephen, I was so struck in reading your book and also reading the primary sources, what deep students of history so many of our presidents have been. John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, Garfield, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, FDR, Truman, JFK, all the way up to George W. Bush and Obama, reading the primary sources of Hamilton and Jefferson, making nuanced arguments about them. You've written great biographies of many of those presidents, including your recent JFK book. What does the fact that these presidents were so deeply engaged in history say about America and about their legacies?
Well, I think, Jeff, I don't want to drag this into the partisan battles of today, but I think it's absolutely vital for an American president to have at least some grounding in American history. And those presidents who you just named were grounded. I would add, by the way, Harry Truman to that list. He was not a college grad. He's our last high school educated president, but Truman was a lover of American history. And it makes a difference to have this understanding about some of the issues that you and I have discussed today, and to understand that these questions are somewhat eternal. And it allows you, I think, to see the opposition not as somehow traitors or enemies of the Republic, but are part of an ongoing debate that is part and parcel of the American experiment. And those presidents who have that historical background bring a kind of moderation, a kind of temperate approach to the issues that we're confronting today. And I think that's just desperately needed.
A knowledge of history helps us recognize that the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson is part of an ongoing debate about the American ideal, a productive tug of war. I am so struck that after Hamilton dies, Jefferson puts his bust in the center hall of Monticello, and you can see it today right in the entrance. And when he passed it, he would smile wryly and say, opposed in life as in death. Jefferson views Hamilton not as a hated enemy to be vanquished, but as a respected opponent to be engaged with. And those presidents who have studied history have recognized that productive tension.
Absolutely true. I used to live in Charlottesville, Jeff, although I would keep my Hamiltonianism under wraps.
Good move.
But when I would take visitors up to Monticello, the tour guide would always point out the busts facing one another. I've said some critical things about Jefferson in our talk today, but again, I do want to make it clear, the United States would be a lesser place without Thomas Jefferson's soaring rhetoric. He was the poet of our revolution. Jefferson ennobled the American experiment by those words in the Declaration. Hamilton had the capability to do that at times, but again, I think would be a lesser system of government, a lesser republic without Jefferson's influence. So we, in a way, have benefited tremendously from that tug and pull back and forth between these two great statesmen.
Despite their mistrust of each other, Hamilton and Jefferson united at the end of their lives around their even greater mistrust of Aaron Burr. Hamilton supported Jefferson over Burr in the election of 1800 and ultimately sacrificed his life because he rightly believed that Burr was a crypto-Caesar who was plotting to separate Louisiana from the United States and betray the Republic. When we return, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his thoughts on the value of how slow deliberation and intentional choices can create lasting impact on our lives.
If the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its powers, the people, whose creature it is, must appeal to the standard they have formed and take such measures to redress the injury done to the Constitution as the exigency may suggest and prudence justify. Alexander Hamilton.
This is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. Ken Burns has spent his career creating films about America, and his latest, On the American Revolution, directed with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, comes out on PBS on November 16th, 2025. Earlier this year, Ken and I had an unforgettable conversation about the wisdom we take from the founders in our daily lives.
That best part of ourselves is what connects us to the light. And that's what our founders were asking us to do, to be responsible citizens. We're to add virtue and tolerance and lifelong learning. And then we would create an environment in which something could happen, and that would be the growth of us. And they talk about that. They're interested in higher emotions.
Say more about that crucial point, their belief that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. And James Madison, he says we have to achieve the same harmony and balance and moderation in the constitution of the state that we achieve in the constitution of our own souls. And the whole point of a constitution is to slow down deliberation so that reason can moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions, so that we can achieve the calm tranquility which defines personal and political virtue.
We have a long way to go, don't we? But they're absolutely right. If you think about it, the architecture of the atom bears a remarkable similarity to the architecture of the solar system. As above, so below. I think that the individual in this system they were imagining, the citizen who had virtue, who had disciplined themselves, who had sacrificed, who had given up in order to grow in this knowledge, would be the atoms of this solar system. And that solar system would be a government, a machine that would go of itself, that would run. What it requires, though, is the cliche of vigilance. But vigilance is a way of saying, in the individual spiritual dimension, kind of self-awareness. It's not staring at your navel. It's just, this is who I am. Oh, I've got that. I'm impatient here. Where did that impatience come from? Will you be able to try to moderate it next time? Can you be more generous to this person? Can you see them as suffering too, and that their manifestation may be rankling you the wrong way, but it may be a feature that you have, and you've been through this, so maybe you have something to guide this person. Can you give away the best of yourself? The only way you do it is to take everything you know in this moment and give it away. And it's the only way in which it's refreshed. It's the only way reciprocity takes place. It engenders you then to give the best of yourself and your knowledge of what our founders were talking about. I mean, it's so amazing that they still resonate in such a way, are completely germane to the conversation. They're not antiquated. The powdered wigs don't mean anything. These ideas are great, and they are permanent, and they jump back to antiquity, and they jump forward to whatever a more perfect union is, whatever happiness is.
And yet they're not sure at the end of their lives that the experiment will succeed, because they don't know whether or not citizens can find enough virtue, self-mastery, devotion to the pursuit of happiness to keep the republic.
Ecclesiastes says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. They know what's coming. They know the characters, the charlatan, the snake oil salesmen, the bullies, the demagogues. They know the righteous. They know all of that stuff. And they're having set something so new, completely new in this world. It changed the course of human events. The inevitable manifestations of human behavior are going to impose themselves. They're desperately trying at the Constitutional Convention to think of every possible way to check, what if somebody does this? And you have Hamilton, you have Jefferson all worrying about how you design something that sort of is foolproof. Well, all the redundancies of safety and the checks and balances. And even then you see today how fragile and easily manipulatable they are. And that's why they've got anxiety. They know who we are. Will and Ariel Durant, the husband and wife historian team, did a survey and said, I don't remember what the exact phrase, but it was something like 138 years of human history, recorded human history, where there wasn't a war going on. I think they missed it. I think there was a war going on at every moment of human history. And that is an unfortunate, sad commentary on us. Our Judeo-Christian traditions say that man is made in God's image. There is almost nothing in our manifestations that suggests that that is true. It is our obligation to move in that direction. We're not made. We have the ability to make ourselves more that way. And that's our project, both the individual project and the American project.
Here's a song I wrote about Alexander Hamilton. The first verse is about his bravery during the Revolution, and the second verse tries to condense the constitutional history of the early republic. Watch out, Lin-Manuel Miranda. Here's the baritone James Martin with Jennifer Blythe at the piano.
I'm Alexander Hamilton. I'm better than Thomas Jefferson. I'm better than Adams and Madison. I'm better than Burr and Jay. Along with General Washington, I fought the Battle of Trenton, a surprise attack on the Hessian, beginning on Christmas Day. After midnight, crossed the Delaware land in sight. By the morning, Hessians in disarray. I'm a hero, shooting a cannon through the snow. Seized with fear, the Hessians surrender and pray. The victory trumpet sounds, America rebounds. The bravery of our plan, acclaimed across the land. With drum and fife, the battle strive, held all my life till Judgment Day. Along with Jimmy Madison, I drafted the Constitution, a more perfect solution to rebels like Daniel Shays. I favored life tenure for presidents, a permanent Washington residence, and also life tenure for senators, hence a Congress that's here to stay. After the convention, rose the Federalist, #1 Nationalist, launched the bank at the Treasury in a day. Fought with Jefferson, came a cropper, what's perfect and proper. Fought with Adams, Madison, Burr, and Jay. The fatal shot resounds, and Aaron Burr rebounds. A would-be Caesar appeared, in just the way I feared. Since Burr's arrest, at my behest, what Caesar repressed, the USA.
That was episode 8 of Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. For episodes 1 through 7, please follow Pursuit on your favorite podcast app. It's already in the top 20 of Apple's history podcasts, and I hope you like it. And if you'd like to check out the 2 complete song cycles I wrote for Pursuit, please check out the C-SPAN link in the show notes. This month, the National Constitution Center honored the Broadway hit Hamilton and the acclaimed historian Ron Chernow with the 2025 Liberty Medal. Here's my conversation from the ceremony in Philadelphia with Ron Chernow. Ron, we have so much to talk about, including the musical and your books, but let's start with the musical. Describe how you met Lin-Manuel Miranda first, and did you have any sense in the early days that the project would become an international sensation?
Well, the story of how I met Lin, so this carries us back to the fall of 2008. I was out walking in my neighborhood of Brooklyn Heights one day. I ran into my old friend Gara, and I said, Gara, what's new? He said, what's new? His daughter had gone to Wesleyan with Lin. He said, what's new? My daughter and I know this hip-hop guy, Lin, who has read your Hamilton book and become obsessed with it, and he would love to meet you. Now, Lin was still starring on Broadway in his first show, which was called In the Heights. So he invited me to a Sunday matinee. Luckily, I liked him. Luckily, I liked the show. And then I said to him backstage, I said, so I gather my book made a big impression on you. He said, Ron, I was reading the book on vacation in Mexico, and as I was reading the book, hip-hop songs started rising off the page. And I said to him, really? You know, it was not a typical reaction to one of my books, you know, at all. And then he said to me, very earnestly, he said, you know, Hamilton's life is a classic hip-hop narrative. And I'm thinking to myself, pal, I have no idea what you're talking about here, you know? He asked me to be the historical consultant to this as yet non-existent show. So I laughed and I said, I mean, you want me to tell you when something is wrong? And he said with great fervor, he said, yes, I want the historians to take this seriously. Well, at that point, you know, I had to make a confession to him. I said, you know, Lin, you're talking to a world-class ignoramus about hip-hop. I know nothing about it. And he said, well, I'm going to educate you. And he pointed out that with hip-hop, you have rhymed endings, you have internal rhymes, you know, you have wordplay. And we signed on, and really, I didn't think that this was ever going to be a big cultural phenomenon. I think his invitation to join the development of the show brought out a certain Mickey Rooney side of my personality. You know, wouldn't this be fun to put on a show together? I was a lifelong theater goer. And so I said, yes. But, Lynn and I worked together on the show for 7 years. And every single person that I met during that 7-year period, whom I told about the show, either said outright or else they were thinking, this has to be the single silliest idea I have ever heard in my life, a hip-hop musical about Alexander Hamilton. And it took me time to figure out what it was about the equation of Hamilton and hip-hop. And I think what it is that, number one, the hip-hop music has a kind of driving, propulsive quality, which actually matches Hamilton's personality. Hamilton is like a character that shot out of a cannon, and the music has that kind of rhythmic excitement to it. The other thing is that since so much of Hamilton's life revolved around his use of words, hip-hop, the lyrics are so dense that the show is almost 3 hours long. It's really a 6-hour show. Actually, we calculated at one point that Hamilton has more lines than Hamlet, and Hamlet is the longest part in Shakespeare. So, the linguistic density of hip hop perfectly suited this person who wrote his way out of poverty and obscurity in St. Croix.
Remarkable. And you were saying, initially you didn't know whether or not it would work, but the early reaction suggested that you really did have something special.
We had certain opportunities to really test the material. One, there was an American songbook series at Lincoln Center. Lynn was asked to lead it off. He came out on stage. He was there with 2 or 3 other singers. Now, this was not staged, it was not choreographed, there was no scenery, there was no costumes. And Lynn just came out and he said, I'm working on this concept album about Alexander Hamilton. You could hear titters in the audience when he said that. So they sang maybe 9 or 10 songs from the show. The show is actually 46 songs altogether, and I was with Oscar Eustis, the head of the Public Theater, and we were sitting there, and at the end, it was mostly the audience, people in their 20s and 30s. At the end, they jumped to their feet, and they were cheering and screaming and applauding, and I turned to Oscar and said, oh my God, if they're having this reaction to just a piece of the show, and a piece that wasn't staged or costumed or anything, imagine when they see the entire thing, they're going to go absolutely crazy, which is what happened. And then also, I remember another time when I had that same reaction. There was a summer theater festival at Vassar called the Powerhouse Theater Festival. It was a black box theater. They performed songs from the first half of the show, just actors standing in front of music stands. And when they finished, I looked across the audience and every single person in the audience was crying. And I was sitting next to my friend, Margot Lyon, great independent theater producer, who was always very politically involved. And she said to me, Ron, this is real patriotism. This is not fake patriotism. But everyone in the theater was crying. So Lynn has this kind of pipeline into people's hearts. He can connect with the audience emotionally. I was saying backstage, Jeffrey, I've not only seen the show here and in London and across the country, I saw it last year, the premiere in Abu Dhabi, and they were on their feet screaming. So this show, Beyond the Politics, it seems to deal in a universal set of emotions. And I've spent a lot of time, Jeffrey, actually thinking about why first the book and then the show were so popular. And I think that one of the reasons is that Hamilton's achievements were so extraordinary that you could admire him, but his flaws were so grave that you could identify with him at the same time. I think that people have liked the idea, because it always seemed like the founders were goody-goodies, but suddenly here was this founder who was so brilliant and productive, but he also was a bad boy at times. So I think that it gave people kind of emotional entryway into the story. But also I think that I was very lucky, and then Lynn, with the musical was lucky, that Hamilton's story is a perfectly structured tragedy. This isn't something that I imposed on his life. It's not something that Lynn imposed on his life. But if you look at the story, Hamilton goes from strength to strength to strength, and then about 3/4 of the way through book, musical, and life, there suddenly is a dying fall. And as in a Greek tragedy, all the qualities that powered his rise suddenly then produce his downfall. And so if you were inventing the story, that's exactly where you would want to have the tragic fall, but it just was this beautifully structured life. I've often said to people, there'll probably never be a great biography of James Madison because it peaks too early, then it kind of rambles on through Secretary of State and two-term, president. Whereas with Hamilton, there was this extraordinary character, a dramatic character at the center of it, but in this perfectly structured life for storytelling.
That's so remarkable. The previous biographies of Hamilton had painted a caricature.
Yeah.
There was a book, Gertrude Atherton's Hamilton, A True Story of Romance. It was a fictionalized biography, 1902. Yeah. It's an international bestseller, the Hamilton musical of its day, and it leads Theodore Roosevelt to create a big Hamilton revival, but it paints him as this heroic, manly, sort of virtuous guy against the fey Jefferson. It doesn't show the nuance. How say more about how capturing him in all of his complexity made him a hero for a divided age?
Well, I should say, when I started the book in 1998, Alexander Hamilton was fading into obscurity. I mean, it seems strange now, but most people had never heard of him before. If they had heard of Hamilton, they knew one or two things: that he was on the $10 bill and that he had died in a duel. Maybe they knew that the person who shot him was Aaron Burr, but the knowledge of him was that limited. And I started reading about his life. Number one, it was clear that just from a personal point of view, that this was far and away the most dramatic life of any of the founders. A completely, self-invented figure. It's just the most astonishing story of this kid who was an autodidact, who comes out of nowhere. He comes to North America just with a handful of introductions. He's effectively orphaned, although in the play he's described as an orphan. Actually, he had a brother who was a carpenter in St. Thomas, and he had a kind of ne'er-do-well father who drifted down to the Grenadines, to an island called Bequia. But for all intents and purposes, he was an orphan. In fact, when he married Eliza, neither his brother nor his father came. So it was like this person was really all alone in the world, and just by dint of the most extraordinary intelligence, created this dazzling intellect, this massive intellect. But part of the fascination of the story, which counts for this tragic quality, is that this dazzling intellect is on top of a very kind of fragile and unstable ego, a psyche, if I can put it that way. Hamilton was illegitimate under the terms of his mother's divorce from earlier man. She was not allowed legally to remarry, so he was illegitimate. It's hard for us today to imagine what illegitimacy meant in the 18th century. He was extremely, extremely sensitive on this subject. He once wrote, he said, "My birth has been the subject of the most humiliating, criticisms," and particularly John Adams called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. This was not funny for Hamilton. And so what would happen, because beneath the tremendous intellect, there was this, very rather kind of brittle psyche because of his background. If he was attacked, he would always counter-attack and often react to it. I mean, I know, Lynn said to me the line that got him interested when he was reading the book was, I wrote that Hamilton, as a teenager, had written this hurricane letter in the local newspaper in St. Croix, and then the local merchants recognized his genius and paid to educate him in North America. And I wrote Hamilton didn't realize it, but he had just written his way out of obscurity. And he was someone at any moment in his career, he fell back on the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, which was really words. But what happened with the Reynolds scandal, the Jeffersonians thought that he was paying James Reynolds the money because they were engaging in illicit treasury speculation together, and it was really, as you well know, because of the adultery. Well, you know, when those charges came out about us having paid this money to James Reynolds, Hamilton felt obliged, again, to resort to his facility with language. And the Reynolds pamphlet, you don't get a sense of this in the show, it was 95 pages long. And so, and one of the ways that I kind of identified with or kind of understood Hamilton was as a writer, because people, you know, his friends at the time when he published the 95-page Reynolds pamphlet all said to me, you know, a delicately worded paragraph or two would have done the trick. You know, so it's like, why did you go on? But I understood as a writer, I could feel it as I was reading the pamphlet. You know, with rewriters, any piece of writing takes on a life of its own. And so you could see that he starts telling it almost as a picaresque novel. So Mariah Reynolds comes to his home, you know, one night here in Philly, and Eliza was off in Albany with her father and the kids, so he was alone. She came, knocked on the door. She claimed she'd been abandoned by her husband. Could he help her out financially? And he said that he would bring money to her room, which was just a few blocks away. And then he writes the Reynolds pamphlet, and when I arrived, she was standing at the top of the stairs, and when I climbed up the stairs, she let me know that more than pecuniary consolation would be acceptable. Now this is really, it's quite, you know, quite hilarious. You can see he's sort of having fun on some level. He's having fun narrating this. And as a writer, he can't help himself in terms of narrating this in this very kind of humorous way. Of course, for Liza, it was not funny. And there's that great scene in the show where she's burning the letters. But you know, we owe to Hamilton's facility with language, we owe both the best and the worst of him. You know, when he was writing the Federalist Papers, as you all know, there were 85 of them. He wrote 51 over a 6-month period. He was writing at least 2 or 3 a week. There was twice he wrote 5 in 1 week. 1 week he wrote 6 in 1 week. And he had a full-time legal practice. He was writing them such white heat that we have anecdotal evidence that the printer would be sitting in the outer office waiting for him to finish it off. And both he and Madison talked about beautifully organized and well-stocked minds. They were writing this under such time pressure, there wasn't time to go and do any research. They were completely writing this out of their head. In fact, I was very surprised to learn that even though Hamilton had originated the Federalist Papers, was supervising it, very often he didn't see Madison's essays until they were already in print. And yet we read this, and the Federalist Papers not only played a role in terms of the ratification of the Constitution, but I remember at the time that I wrote the book, the figure was that it had been, Federalist Papers had been cited by the Supreme Court more than any other document or set of documents. Already, and this was around 2000, had been cited 300 times by the Supreme Court. And this was something that these 3 men, there was also John Jay did 5 of the essays. When you think about the time pressure they were doing and how extraordinary their achievement was and how kind of beautifully furnished their minds were, that they were able to literally whip these things off and that they have stood the test of time.
It's so great to see Hamilton as a writer on deadline. And
yeah, and what a deadline.
And what a deadline. And as you said, it was that one sentence in your book, Hamilton didn't realize it, but he'd just written his way out of poverty that convinced Lin-Manuel Miranda to write the musical. The rap against Hamilton by his greatest antagonist, Jefferson, was that he was a closet monarchist, a crypto-Caesar conspiring to resurrect monarchy in America. It all came back to a dinner where Hamilton had blurted out when Jefferson said the 3 greatest men in history were John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Hamilton blurted out, the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar. And Jefferson records, this proves that Hamilton is a closet monarchist. You say that Hamilton was probably joking because he had worried about a Caesar at the head of Shays' Rebellion and he feared Caesarism as much as Jefferson. And yet he did favor a president elected for life, and even his friend Gouverneur Morris wasn't sure whether he yearned to resurrect monarchy. So how devoted was he to
I
a
noticed,
Republican president?
in your book, you have a couple of places where he cites Julius Caesar, where he's criticizing someone, as a Caesar or a proto-Caesar. Okay, what happened, so he goes to the Constitutional Convention. His role is extremely important there because the governor of New York, Clinton, believe it or not, he was quite the boss. In fact, it was sort of governors like Clinton that Hamilton and Madison had in mind in terms of strong central government that would correct some of the abuses of the state. And George Clinton sends 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But Governor Clinton was so afraid of any kind of centralizing tendency that might limit his power that 2 of his appointees, Lansing and Yates, actually left the Constitution in the middle, never signed it. So Hamilton is the only New York delegate there. So he's a kind of very, very important figure, and he kind of signs it in his personal name. Okay, there is one moment during the Constitution where Hamilton gets up and talks for 6 hours. It's referred to in the show that someone says that he got up there and talk in the convention was listless. They don't really talk about what the content of the speech was. So Hamilton, as the show says, created his own form of government, and what it would be was essentially an elective monarchy. That the president would serve for life and senators would serve for life. There would be a house that would be elected by universal suffrage, at least as defined at the time. Now, a couple of points to make. Hamilton was never in favor of a hereditary aristocracy or hereditary monarchy or anything like that. He also always pointed out in terms of this form of government that he presented at the Constitutional Convention. Number one, it would be an elected president. It would not be a hereditary president. And number 2, that it would be a president who would be serving on good behavior. So he could be impeached and recalled. So it was not just, do I think that was a great idea? No. to state the obvious. But I think that Hamilton's fear was that the great weakness of the new republic was going to be what he called a lack of energy in the executive branch. He was very afraid that when you've gone through many years of revolution as we had, the spirit of defiance of authority has become so strong, it's difficult to turn it off. And there was Shays' rebellion, there were different kind of popular outbreaks that seemed to him to confirm his theory. Now, he wanted a strong executive, and this was a real kind of ideological split with Jefferson. Hamilton claimed that the best safeguard of liberty would be a strong executive. Jefferson felt that the greatest threat to liberty would be a strong executive. Obviously, 2 very, very different views. But since I had a hunch you might ask me about it, I just wanted to read a couple of things that Hamilton wrote, because actually he was perhaps our greatest prophet of populist demagogues, if I may read a couple of things. In Federalist number 1, he wrote, "Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing as demagogues and ending as tyrants." Another time he warned of the advent of a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, and someone who was unprincipled in private life, who would foment chaos and ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Because Hamilton made that speech, Hamilton, I think, had more of a role in calling Constitutional Convention and getting the Constitution ratified, certainly in New York, and explicated through the Federalist Papers. He thought that the Constitution would not stand the test of time, that indeed that would be a fatal weakness, the lack of executive power. But throughout his life, he contended that he saw the Constitution that we have as sort of beautiful, but idealistic and unrealistic. He thought that time would prove him, correct about that, but he did not try to subvert the Constitution. He made an interesting statement 2 years before he died. He said, "Mine is an odd destiny. Perhaps no man in the United States has done more for the present Constitution than myself. And contrary to all my anticipations of its fate, as you know from the very beginning, I'm still laboring to prop the frail and worthless fabric. Yet I have the murmurs of its friends no less than the curses of its foes for my rewards. What can I do better than withdraw from the scene? Every day proves to me more and more that this American world was not made for me." So he was kind of very, very hurt by that idea that he had tried to subvert the Constitution. And it's interesting, when Jefferson is Secretary of State and Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury, at first Washington does not fathom the degree of personal and ideological hostility between the two men. But then when he does, Washington, being a great president, wanted actually to have the interplay of different ideas. He did not want to have a monolithic cabinet at all. And he wrote a letter to Jefferson, because Jefferson had kept saying that Hamilton was behind this monarchical plot in the United States. And Washington writes him a letter saying, as to the idea that, of a monarchical plot, he said, "I don't think that there are 10 men in America whose opinions are worthwhile who believe that to be true." Now, Washington was in the best position to know if there had been any plot, but I spent 5 or 6 years working on that book, and while Hamilton's views on the elective monarchy and everything we're talking about, he didn't hide that. He was open about it, but I could never find a single letter where he was conspiring with someone else, in a plot. In fact, I felt, because when I started doing the book, I read all these previous books, and Hamilton was often described as this kind of intriguing, designing character. The deeper I got into his life, he was almost excessively honest and open about his views. Every view he held, he would write at voluminous length. Hamilton was never content on any issue just to write one essay. He would write a series of 5 or 10 or 20. He was not the sort of personality who could engage in a plot. He was very much a kind of, look at me character.
He's invoked on behalf of so many constitutional positions today. The unitary executive theory is attributed to his Pacificus letters, and he was the champion of the liberal construction that John Marshall used to uphold the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, and which broad supporters of national power have invoked ever since. We're here at the Constitution Center gazing at Independence Hall. What would you sum up as Hamilton's greatest constitutional contributions?
Well, let me just first mention what he created in his life, because again, when I started the book, I felt, kind of whatever his flaws, personally or politically, what this man managed to create was extraordinary. Even before he became Treasury Secretary, of course, he had written the appeal for the Constitutional Convention, had written Federalist Papers, and had to be ratified in New York. He spoke 26 times in 6 weeks. New York was one state where it looked like it would not be passed. Hamilton got it passed in New York, which was very quick. He then, even before he becomes Treasury Secretary, creates the Bank of New York, first private bank in New York City. He then becomes Treasury Secretary and restores American credit with his funded debt. He creates the first central bank, the Bank of the United States. He creates the first mint. He creates the first Coast Guard. Creates the first customs service, on and on and on and on. This man really forged the federal government, and so I think that he was somebody. There were kind of 3 sides to Hamilton's contribution. One was kind of on the level of politics and ideology. One was in terms of his concrete contributions, and then also very important, and one of the reasons that I think Washington appointed Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary was that everything was setting a precedent. Here they had this Constitution, which was beautiful, but it was very brief and very general in terms of what this would actually translate into. And so Washington, who was at great pains to make sure that everything, that he did was consistent with the Constitution, knew that Hamilton is a lawyer, and Hamilton, who had attended the Constitutional Convention and was a great lawyer, that Hamilton would make sure that everything that was done during his 2 terms as president would fit into the constitutional framework. So I think that his contributions were really quite extraordinary. And when I started writing the book in 1998, I just felt he was so villainized and so, caricatured. And it just seemed like a shame that a man who had made such immense contributions to the creation of our government, should have become this forgotten figure. So it's kind of funny now because I see in surveys Americans are asked to name their favorite founder, and this founder whom no one knew anything about suddenly is everyone's favorite. And I'll just tell you one last story, Jeffrey, that after the show opened, the Obama administration, Jack Lew was the Treasury Secretary, and he announced one day that he was dropping Hamilton from the $10 bill. And he was going to replace Hamilton with Harriet Tubman. Okay, I love Harriet Tubman, but I wanted to keep Hamilton. After Jack Lew made that announcement, there was a hue and cry against it. And he came to the theater one night, and I saw him in the audience, and I said, would you like to come backstage and meet Lin-Manuel Miranda? So we went backstage, and he told us, he didn't say that he was going to revoke his opinion. He just said, I think you're going to be pleased when you hear the title. But he admitted to us, he said the one thing that he had not reckoned on was the power of the musical. Actually kept Hamilton on the $10 bill, and we had it straight from the mouth of the Treasury Secretary.
Well, from saving Hamilton on the $10 bill to resurrecting his reputation throughout American history, you've shown in an electrifying way the extraordinary power of history to change American culture. One last question about the show. After I'm about to award you the Liberty Medal, which I'm so looking forward to doing, and then we're going to hear a performance of Satisfaction by Angelica. I gather she's one of your favorite characters. Tell us why you like the song.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In the show, Eliza meets Hamilton. She has this beautiful song, Helpless. And then you have Angelica sings this song, Satisfied. And basically, both songs are about their feelings about Hamilton. And Eliza, being younger, is looking at Hamilton through the eyes of innocence, and that Angelica is looking at Hamilton through the eyes of experience. And incidentally, one bit of dramatic license. In the show, when Hamilton meets the Schuyler sisters, both Schuyler sisters are single. But in fact, in reality, Angelica was married, and her husband, John Barker Church, was a member of Parliament in England. So, but Lynn said, and I understood dramatically why he did this, that having Hamilton meet both of the sisters together certainly injects a lot of drama in terms of which sister he would choose. But it's actually, I think, not only the great moment in the show, but maybe in musical theater, because what Lynn does, for those of you who remember the show, Angelica brings Hamilton over to meet Eliza. And he says, if it took a war for me to meet you, then it was worth it. Then you see the same scene. It's kind of redone. It's rewound. And he again goes over a second time. You have the same scene. But in the meantime, Angelica has given us this really much more realistic and even cynical interpretation of Hamilton as someone who would never be satisfied, and that much as Eliza loved Hamilton, that this was not going to be an easy marriage for him. And I asked Lynn, because I so loved that sequence and the repeating the scene, I said, where did you get that idea? Because They do the scene, and then you hear the chorus saying, rewind. Well, Lynn had a hip-hop improv group called Freestyle Love Supreme. And what they would do, they would ask the audience to throw out different words. And from the words that the audience threw out, the 5 hip-hop people would create a story. Amazing, but they would do it. And then he said what they would do when they finished creating a story from the words thrown out from the audience, one of the 5 would say, rewind, and they would do the same story but with a different ending. And that's where he got the idea. Just extraordinarily ingenious that he would have thought of doing it. But I love the song, and then I always used to say that the smartest person in the show was Angelica. Hamilton was pretty smart too. But there's no question that Angelica was quite extraordinary. You know, there are certain things in the show that are so perfect that you think they must be invented, but they're not. And I remember when I was going through Eliza's papers at Columbia, I saw this little handwritten note in a very fine penmanship, and I pulled it out, and it was the note that Angelica had written to Eliza after the disclosure of the Reynolds affair, after the Reynolds pamphlet, when Eliza would, of course, have been completely shattered. And she writes to Eliza, in marrying our Hamilton, you married an Icarus, and he has flown too close to the sun. Now that's in that beautiful song that Eliza sings when she's burning the letters. And she says, you know what Angelica said, you know, and talks about Hamilton being this Icarus who flew too close to the sun. I'm sure 99% of the people, 99.9% of the people who see the show think that that must be an invented line, but that was actually something that Angelica did write to Eliza. And I can remember feeling a chill going down my spine when I came upon that letter. But it was such a sophisticated observation, as well as an accurate observation about Hamilton, that he climbed and climbed and climbed, and then he flew too close to the sun, and his wings melted. Yeah.
Ron Chernow, you show us that history is storytelling and that the role of the historian can be dramatic, exciting, and even heroic. I can't tell you how much you are one of my heroes among historians. I was inspired to write about Hamilton, reading your description of his financial plan and seeing the clarity with which you took the technical complications and made them dramatic. Inspired me to want to try to achieve a fraction of that much clarity. And in the process, your historical writing, not only Hamilton, but Washington, Grant, and more, has transformed a nation's understanding of history and inspired new generations of history lovers. And that's what's so beautiful about that gorgeous performance we just heard, and all of those kids going to Edgeham, and all of them just that curiosity sparked and having their passion for learning about history ignited by the marvelous storytelling that you have shared with us. Please join me in thanking Ron Chernow. For the full 2025 Liberty Medal ceremony, visit constitutioncenter.org/Liberty Medal. Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness, is produced by PRX Productions for the National Constitution Center. From PRX Productions, the team is Genevieve Sponsler, Courtney Florentine, David Newtown, Sandra Lopez Monsalve, Tommy Bazarian, Pedro Rafael Rosado, Gregory Parks, and Jocelyn Gonzalez. This episode was produced by Bill Pollack and Griffin Ritchie. It was recorded by PRX, Advanced Staging Productions, David Stotts, and mixed by Bill Pollack. Research was provided by Griffin Ritchie, Anna Salvatore, Trey Sullivan, and Tristan Worsham. Music and lyrics by Jeffrey Rosen. The baritone was James Martin, and the great Jennifer Blythe was at the piano. If you'd like the Alexander Hamilton song on Pursuit, please check out the 2 complete song cycles I wrote for the podcast. James Martin, Jennifer Blythe, and I performed them in September at the American Philosophical Society. You can find the C-SPAN video of the recital in the show notes. For more on Alexander Hamilton, please check out my new book, The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. If you'd like a signed bookplate, email me at jrosen@constitutioncenter.org. Please recommend the show to friends, colleagues, or anyone anywhere who's eager for a weekly dose of constitutional debate, with or without Alexander Hamilton. Sign up for the newsletter at constitutioncenter.org/connect. And always remember, friends, the National Constitution Center is a private nonprofit. All of this inspiring light and learning is possible only because of your generosity, passion, and engagement for all our programming, including the podcast. Please consider donating at constitutioncenter.org/donate. On behalf of the National Constitution Center, I'm Jeffrey Rosen.